Hey guys, a relatively short one today. So recently, the president of South Africa met with Trump. Now, you might want to know what the whole situation is going on in South Africa because a lot of people are talking about it. So, a quick little history lesson for you. Back in, let's say, the 1600s and the 1700s, a lot of Dutch moved down to South Africa. Eventually, they were joined by some French and some Germans, but mostly the Dutch made up a lot of the people who moved down there. They settled a mostly uninhabited area of South Africa. Now, during that time, the land wasn't really farmed that much. At least not in that area. Like I said, that area was basically completely uninhabited. The Dutch moved down there and formed a whole bunch of farms because, well, the Dutch are very, very, very good at farming. For hundreds of years, they would be farming down there, but they would eventually run into issues with the Zulus. Now, if you don't know much about the Zulus, they were a tribe that was basically separated from any other civilized nation in the world. Now, one thing that people kind of not don't understand is just how isolated South Africa is from the rest of the world. For example, if you go a little bit north, you will run into a rainforest filled with a bunch of disease-carrying mosquitoes. You go north of that, you'll hit an endless desert called the Sahara, obviously. But between the two, if you're, say, trying to get to Egypt, you would run into a whole host, a wide swath of swampland that was almost completely impassable. In fact, the Romans actually tried to find the source of the Nile, and it wouldn't be found until hundreds upon hundreds of years later. In fact, it wouldn't be found until I think like the 1800s or so. It was absolutely insane how isolated South Africa was. They couldn't go east because if you go north and then you try to go east to Madagascar, you wouldn't be able to make it to Madagascar because the winds in that area always go west, meaning that Madagascar was never, um, I would say, colonized. By any Afrikaners, or sorry, not Afrikaners, Africans. And it was actually colonized by people from India who were following the trade winds. And the people in South Africa, they couldn't go north because of the endless rainforest up there. And they couldn't make it through with any large numbers. And they couldn't go south because there's nothing further south than Africa, besides for Antarctica. They would never make it anywhere of value. And they couldn't go west because of the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. So they were basically trapped there. Without any access to horses or any other technology or learning from any other place in the world, they were kind of screwed. This is actually why America was so technologically backwards by the time the Europeans got there. After all, the only real animals that they could tame that could carry large loads or relatively large loads were reindeer, which were, well, isolated to a very specific region of North America and in relatively cold or mountainous areas. Llamas, which were relatively small, living in South America, mostly in the Indies. And then you had buffalo, which are, well, let's say they're a little bit more temperamental than other types of cattle like creatures. Not very easy to tame, let's just say. And then, of course, they had dogs, which again would work well in the snow for pulling like sleds and such, but carrying large loads or bringing wagons, not really things that um, dogs are known for. So when the Afrikaners, which are the Dutch and eventually the Germans and the French, eventually settled in South Africa, the only real tribe of note were the Zulus. Now, the Zulus were, again, very technologically backwards, and it's not really any fault of theirs because they had no access to like a good set of transportation without being able to have large animals. Like every other technological advancement is much harder to actually get through, and then they didn't have any horses. The Zulu saw that the Dutch were farming the land and producing their own food, something that was not very common, or at least not to the extent and not to the technological advancement that the Zulus were used to. So they started to attack the Afrikaners and trying to steal their land and steal their produce. Now, again, this land was uninhabited because South Africans, the Zulus at the time, didn't really know how to exploit the land, to use it to their advantage like this. And the people, the Dutch, were actually very good traders with people who, didn't want to murder them. Eventually, the land was eventually taken over by the British, who formed a colony there and decided to protect the Afrikaners who had settled there and their descendants. The Afrikaners have now been there for over 300 years, again on land that was uninhabited and unfarmed. This land has been in the hands of families going back literal centuries at this point. But what was going on now was, well, hold on, let's go back a little bit. Before World War I broke out, in about 1914, or around about when World War I started, a party was formed to protect the Afrikaners. Now, this party would eventually go on to be mostly controlled by the British and would push for apartheid. Now, like any other political party that was suppressing the majority of people in a nation, there were revolts and other like protests against this. And unfortunately, while a lot of people remember him as a hero before eventually ending apartheid and bringing the power back to the majority, that is one big issue with democracy. And I have mentioned this before. Democracy is the tyranny of the majority over the minority. And this has been true throughout history. For example, back in the time of Athens, during their republic, one of the problems is that whenever they would have a court case, they would have hundreds of jurors during the trial. Now, if you had people who were biased against the defendant, who were not, weeded out, or you could significantly bribe people, even with so much as just a good meal or something, you could easily have someone executed who basically had done nothing wrong. I believe it was actually Plato who was executed, or was it Socrates? I always forget. Now, Plato's allegory of the Republic has its very own issues that we would talk about at some other time, but basically, this is something that's brought up in the Starship Troopers book. And it's basically the rule of the intelligent or the philosophers over the majority. Now, in this kind of government, what would happen would be that anyone considered too stupid would not be allowed to control the government, which you would think would be a good thing, but as you can see from, mid-century German, putting the smartest people in charge who have very little social skills in many cases, or, might be outright sociopaths, may not always be the best idea. And given how much people didn't like philosophers even back then, it is Well, philosophers were held in high regards, but the fact that many of them were executed, or, you know, yeah, like Archimedes was killed for being a total. Let's just say antisocial is one word for it. Sometimes putting people who are smart in charge is not always the best idea because smart people are not always the best leaders. Putting the majority in charge is not always the best either. Like I said, democracy is the tyranny of the majority over the minority. Now, this is why the United States is a republic, being represented by both a legislature, the House, and a Senate chamber. You have equal representation in the Senate for each and every state, meaning that no matter how big the population is of a state, they still have the ability to protect their small population. While the bigger populations of like states like California are not able to throw their weight around. They have equal representation as Delaware or Maryland or Rhode Island, for example. Now, I think some states should be broken up a little bit, but, well, some states have too much power in the House, but it wouldn't really change much, all that. Since, if you were to break a state up, they might change, like, who their governor is and change their state legislature, which may have people move from a bigger state to the smaller state because, like, taxes might be lower, but if in the short term, anyways, breaking up a state like California, for example, might solve some issues, but in the long term, it might not work out like you think. Anyways, so the party was formed in 1914, and eventually a person by the name of Nelson Mandela was thrown in jail. Now, he was seen as a hero trying to end apartheid and stop racial segregation. However, one thing you have to keep in mind is that he was a socialist. Now, the party he was affiliated with was supposedly affiliated with a social democrat party, but you have to remember that this party was called the Labor and Socialist Movement. Now, like I said in a previous video, I used to consider myself a social democrat until I kind of grew up and realized that while some social policies may be worthwhile, there is an issue with the government's inefficiency in controlling these organizations, such as Medicare and Medicaid. On a large scale, hell, even a small scale like the military, which only makes up 0.7% of the nation's population, it can still be inefficient, especially since these organizations always try to go with the lowest bidder. Hold on. Sorry, that might be a little bit of a jarring transition there. Anyways, talking about Nelson Mandela. So he was part of a socialist movement in South Africa. He was eventually arrested and eventually he was freed in order to lead his movement into the future. Now, one of the problems with socialist movements, just like what happened in Germany, which, again, the funny mustache man and his buddy, the funny hat dude in Italy, were, well, they were heavily influenced by socialism. In fact, their movements were based on socialism. And when you have a movement that is fueled by revenge and anger and wanting to violently, in some cases, remove the leading power in the local area, you have to remember that, well, one of the things that happened was Nelson's wife had been captured and imprisoned for 2 years, and well, she wasn't treated very well. Let's just say, at least according to some reports. Now, there might be people who have extensive knowledge on the subject, which I don't, so I can't tell you for sure, but in the case of his wife, well, to say she was a psychopath would be. It would be kind of an insult to psychopaths. You see, she endorsed a specific type of execution called necklacing. Now, if you don't know what that is, it is an absolutely horrific way to um, take somebody out of this world by putting a tire around their chest and filling it with gasoline and lighting it on fire. Let's just say the results are not pretty, and death by fire is one of the worst you can possibly experience. It was absolutely medieval type of horrific in terms of how it dealt with people. Well, again, she outright endorsed this. And when the majority took over, they added in a social democrat, you might say, but it was more like a democratic socialist type of government. And in a democratic socialist type of government, of course, the government is actually controlled by, you guessed it, the majority. Well, that is a very, very bad thing when it comes to, protecting minorities. And since the minority had been in charge of the country for so long, well, let's just say that things have gotten worse and worse and worse for people called the Boers. Now, the Boers are specifically people who have descended from the Dutch. Now, similarly to the fact that I am a good friend. Pardon me for a second. Sorry about that. Now, I was talking about how the new government treats the minority people in the country. Now, again, the Dutch themselves haven't really done anything of, well, they didn't really suppress the South Africans as much as people might tell you. Mostly it was the British who kind of enforced apartheid. And they were the ones who are often elected in the high positions of government. Now, there were Dutch in that government, but the Dutch were mostly farmers. And while they're still a minority, they wanted to make sure their land and their people and their farms and their livelihoods were protected. Well, now with the control of the majority, who are in many cases socialist and violent, they want to eliminate any person who doesn't look like them. Now, if this sounds at all familiar to anybody, you would call this a very racist thing. And, well, the Dutch, the Boers, the Afrikaners, had not been treated very nicely, which is why recently people from South Africa are allowed to be brought into America on terms of as refugees, because unlike in other countries who pretend to be going through hardships, there are a lot of people who've been brought in from other countries that are not at war, who are not suffering from any major social or cultural unrest. There is significant unrest in South Africa, and in many cases, the lives of people there are in a lot of danger. Now, I was talking about how in Ukraine, I have a friend who has been in the Ukrainian part of the country, Dnipro, I believe, and he has been trying to leave the country. Now, when the war first started, he was highly patriotic and he wanted to protect his country or do as much as he could to help, but he has medical issues that keep him from serving in the military. Now, recently, he has fallen, well, highly apathetic to the plight of his country because he sees Zelensky as, well, a tyrant and as somebody who is prolonging the war unnecessarily. Now he wants to actually lead that country. I also have a friend in South Africa who is, well, he is highly afraid for his life and he wants to move to America. Now, he's been going through some difficulties and he actually won't respond to me on Discord anymore. It's nothing I personally did, but he has been going through some pretty hard challenges and, well, he doesn't want to. I am not 100% sure, honestly, but let's just say that people in South Africa are rightly afraid for their lives. Now, people in America who don't understand that, you can be racist against white people, obviously, there has been a lot of issues with convincing people that you don't have to be not white to be oppressed. Shocking, I know. It's almost like white people are actually a minority in the world or something. And South Africa has been heavily criticized by the Trump administration for exactly this reason, for their treatment of their white population, including turning a blind eye to the fact that calls for the death of all Boers inside South Africa have become so prominent, especially during, as ridiculous as it sounds, during concerts where they will chant this over and over again. And, well, let's say the death toll has been unfortunate, highly north of unfortunate. And again, for the racists in America who think that white people cannot be oppressed, go fuck yourselves, for one. But for two, this is exactly what America is supposed to stand for. We're supposed to stand for oppressed minorities, and our government was specifically set up in order for the minority to have a voice in the government. If you don't realize just how many non-white people are in Congress, you would realize that we actually put emphasis on putting minorities in positions of power. And that's not even a bad thing. It's just that a lot of people who are on a certain side of the aisle, the Democrats, like to push race politics and assume that because they are a different shade of color, which again, if you're not aware of the science, people who live closer to the equator tend to have darker skin to protect them from UV rays so they don't get skin cancer or sunburn, while people in the north who would suffer from vitamin D deficiency need to have white skin in order to absorb more rays from the sun, especially during the winter months, so they don't get depressed or are still healthy enough to survive. Yeah, skin color is based on where your people grew up, based on how far away they are from the equator. Amazing, I know. It's almost as if our bodies were adapted to different environments throughout the world, and it has nothing to do with one race being better at, well, let's say that people in Africa who are of a darker complexion are better at surviving in hot environments, while people who are of lighter complexion in the far north are better at surviving in cold climates. Oh my god, science is real. Sometimes you have to believe the science, except when it comes for skin color for some reason among the Democrats. Don't ask me why. Skin color is one of the sciences that they don't, take into account ever. I would say that Democrats are just highly racist, as they have always been, since the days they've been pushing for slavery to come back. Anyways, yeah, it's amazing just how much Democrats want to use Chinese slave labor in order to get cheaper goods, despite the fact how much gas is used by those giant container ships. It's almost like having those uh, factories in America would actually save on fossil fuels or something. No, that's crazy talk. Insanity. We have to transport items all the way across the biggest ocean in the world, where basically all of Europe could fit inside the Atlantic Ocean and still have enough space left over for another few continents. Again, it's almost like Democrats don't care about the environment whatsoever or care about the rights of the minorities as long as the minorities actually give them the power that they desire. You can tell how frustrated I am with this whole situation. Well, the president of South Africa just got the reaming of his life for good reason by President Trump. And it seems it hasn't gone very well for the president of South Africa. Thank God. So hopefully at least some of this violence will be addressed at some point. And hopefully the wars in both Ukraine and in Israel, Palestine, will be ended relatively soon so people stop dying needlessly. Frustrating. I'm just glad that my friends in both Ukraine and in South Africa are still alive, even if the one in South Africa doesn't talk to me anymore. Anyways, before I go on to a whole binger about my social life and the people involved therein, I think I'll leave it there, guys. Protect the boars. Bye.